Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah amma ba'd. So before I start this presentation, just a quick summary of the previous webinar. I focused on the Shimla Agreement because it's the basis of the Indian argument that Kashmir is an internal issue for India to sort out, and that Pakistan nor anyone else can interfere. But my presentation was about how India had been treating Kashmir like an external enemy country since even before independence. So basically, India cannot be trusted to treat Kashmir equally and fairly. The focus of this presentation, as you might be able to guess from the title, is more about the political side of things, about how Kashmir has a tradition of being politically organized and demanding their rights. And on the other hand, India has a tradition of undermining democracy in Kashmir. And to what end? To basically avoid giving Kashmiris the referendum they had promised. And this will become particularly obvious with the IndiraSheikh Accord, which I will go into more detail about. Just to keep in mind, my intention is not to demoralize you, but to give you understanding. If you're in this webinar, you want to see a Kashmir free from oppression, and that means knowing our history. And on top of that, there will be some points where we can take even hope and even motivation from the examples of the Kashmiris themselves. They have not lost their sense of dignity and Muslim identity. So I've made some bold claims. How am I going to prove them to you? How is my argument and this presentation structured? So there's a lot of information to take in. So this presentation is structured like a timeline, which I hope is the simplest way to present these events and political decisions. I've chopped up the timeline according to the Legislative Assembly elections. Basically, it's those elections that decide who's running Kashmir. So they're pretty, convenient turning points in my narrative. And I'll mention other kinds of elections too, like the Lok Sabha elections for the Central Indian Parliament. And something I noticed in my research of this time period was that some politicians and parties evolved in reaction to the changing political reality in Kashmir. So I'll go into this in more detail, but I found a couple of examples very interesting, namely Sheikh Muhammad Abdullah and the Jamaati Islami Party. So keep an ear out for them as I talk. And this presentation ends on 1990 because, in a way, that was the end of democracy in Kashmir when India imposed direct governor's rule and stopped pretending to treat them as equal Indian citizens. I should point out, not all the information I'm presenting is on the slide. I don't really like giving walls of text. I think that puts people off rather than helping you absorb information. So please do listen closely. And most importantly, politics is all about different opinions, and I ask you to hear me out through to the end, but there will be a Q&A at the end. And as I showed in my previous presentations, I am happy to take on any facts that I'd missed in my own research. And just to clarify, when I'm talking about Kashmir, I'm mainly talking about the region that is now controlled by India. So that's here. And there are also other areas that are part of this region called Jammu, Ladakh, and Aksai Chin. It gets a bit confusing because these historical areas were then split in between India, Pakistan, and China. But when I talk about Kashmir, I'm talking about the entire Indian controlled region. Sometimes I'll refer to specific parts. So let's get into the history of democracy in Kashmir. In 1909, the Young Men's Muslim Association is set up in Kashmir. It's a global organization, but at this time it doesn't really have a huge impact in Kashmir. Not until 1922, when it's revived under Chowdhury Ghulam Abbas, and that's when it really starts to speak out against the Dogra Prince's Islamophobic authority. And at this stage, it's not exactly a political movement, but it does keep the Muslims of Kashmir active and aware and united politically. So that's why the events of 13th July 1931 had such an impact on the future of Kashmiri politics and self-identity. So what happened on that day? Well, that day is commemorated as Martyrs' Day up to December of last year, 2019, actually. And I would actually need a whole presentation about this one incident because it is so intense. But basically, this event inspired Muslims to form a movement to oppose Islamophobic oppression by the Dogra Prince. And just one point that I do want to go into detail about, why is it called Martyrs' Day? Because on this day, at a trial of someone who had spoken out against the Dogra Prince, the police arrested protesters getting ready for Dhuhr prayers, and the adhan was said as an act of defiance. And that muaddin was shot by the police. And then someone else stepped up to continue the adhan, and he was also shot. And this happened over and over again. And in the end, 22 people died because they continued the adhan and then continually were shot. And well, on the back of this, Kashmiris didn't sit back and just watch the oppression continue. On the 15th of October 1932, the All Jammu and Kashmir Muslim Conference is formed to keep up the political momentum that had been growing since the Martyrs' Day. And it would be led by Sheikh Muhammad Abdullah, Chaudhry Ghulam Abbas, and others. Over time, Sheikh Muhammad would prefer Kashmir to join India rather than join Pakistan, or for Kashmir to gain full independence. So on the 11th of June 1939, he renamed the party All Jammu and Kashmir National Conference and made the party become secular to help pull in a bigger base. This didn't sit well with everyone in the National Conference. So in 1941, Chaudhry Ghulam Abbas and others split away and revived the old name, All Jammu and Kashmir Muslim Conference. Meanwhile, there were other Kashmiri Muslims who weren't interested in what they saw as the, Muslim nationalism of the Muslim conference, but they still wanted to see Islam represented in Kashmiri politics. So, by tapping into this support base in 1945, the Jamaat-e-Islami expanded into Kashmir. Now, I just want to make a note. There were many other Muslim groups in Kashmir, and I'm not ignoring them, but for the sake of focus, I'm only highlighting Jamaat-e-Islami because they'll play a major role in 1987 onwards. I'll come back to them. In 1946, the National Conference step up their agitation against the Dogra Prince in a campaign called Quit Kashmir. And in the meantime, the Muslim Conference ally with the India Muslim League, which is basically the conceptual forerunner to Pakistan. And on 19th July 1947, they pass a resolution that they want Jammu and Kashmir to join Pakistan. And this is probably why they're never accepted as a political party in the Indian occupied Kashmir. So you won't see them mentioned in elections. And on the 15th of August 1947, India gains independence from Britain. Okay, so I'm just going to pause there. We've learned a lot in this one slide. But if I was to summarize this whole slide into one sentence, what I would say is really clear is that even before the birth of India, Kashmiris knew that they had to stand up for themselves, and they learned how to do that politically. That's basically a summary of this slide. So the Constituent Assembly. So the 26th of October 1947, the Dogra ruler decides to join India in exchange for military defense, and Article 370 is added to the drafted Indian constitution, which should have protected Kashmir's autonomy and promised a future referendum to determine Kashmir's independence. On the 31st of October 1947, an emergency administration is set up to run Kashmir, headed by the India-leaning National Conference under Sheikh Mohammed. Yet on January 1948, the Enemy Agents Ordinance is passed, which created a police state, enabled surveillance structures involving police and the ruling National Conference establishment. It denied suspects to legal defense counsel and could lead to life imprisonment or execution. On the 21st of April 1948, UN Resolution 47 is adopted, outlining a plebiscite in Jammu and Kashmir to decide which country to join. And on the 17th of April 1949, Jawaharlal Nehru India's first Prime Minister admits in a letter that the prize we are fighting for is the Valley of Kashmir, showing that there never was any Indian will to let the Kashmiri people decide their own fate. 26th of January 1950, the Constitution application to Jammu and Kashmir order is adopted, formally bringing Article 370 into the finalized Indian Constitution, which, sounds great. But then on the 26th of February 1950, so literally 1 month later, the Preventative Detention Act is enacted, which curbs political dissent. The 27th of October 1950, the National Conference announces their intent to have an election to form a Constituent Assembly, which would then form the Kashmiri Constitution, which would work in partnership with the Indian Constitution. And Pakistan actually complained about this to the UN, that this could undermine the Resolution 47. And India promised it would honor the resolution, including the plebiscite that would let Kashmiris choose which country to join. 30th of March 1951, UN Resolution 91 is passed, which, amongst other points, confirmed that the plebiscite must still go ahead. And a plebiscite is, if you don't know, it's a vote where you consult every citizen in a country or a region. And that plebiscite would have been about Kashmir joining India or Pakistan. September to October 1951, the Constituent Assembly is elected and the National Conference wins all 75 seats and were unopposed in most. Okay, just to summarize this time period, what's really clear is that India promises a referendum and prepares for it in a way by silencing dissent. So if a referendum does happen, then there aren't any anti-India leaders left to push for a vote out. Just for comparison, it would have been like the UK government locking up the Scottish SNP before the Scottish referendum. That's how absurd and obviously two-faced this political behavior is. Okay, so up to the first assembly. 8th of August 1953, Sheikh Abdullah, the first Prime Minister of India-controlled Kashmir, is imprisoned with 34 other politicians loyal to him after he told a US diplomat that he wanted Kashmir to be independent, and he also faced friction in his own ministerial cabinet and lost his majority support there. 9th August 53, Bakshi Ghulam Muhammad replaces Sheikh Muhammad. He's given control of the so-called Peace Brigade, and basically this so-called Peace Brigade are government-paid thugs who would attack pro-independence leaders, activists, and premises. 14th of May 1954, Article 35A is added to the Indian Constitution, which safeguards the rights of residency and ownership to existing residents, which should, in theory, prevent India's only Muslim majority province from being theologically cleansed. And 9th of August 1955, the plebiscite front is formed, and it's led by Mirza Muhammad Afzal Beg, but it's really seen as Sheikh Muhammad's splinter group and his kind of his front and his voice. Their main demand was a UN-run plebiscite. The 17th of November 1956, Kashmir's state constitution is adopted, so the Constituent Assembly's role is fulfilled. So in 1957, the president of pro-independence group Kashmir Political Conference is forcibly banished, and he would never be allowed to return and would die in exile. The Constituent Assembly, now that the job was done, there was an election for the first assembly in 1957, and the National Conference won 69 seats out of 75, 47 of which were unopposed, and the Indian installed Bakshi was reappointed Prime Minister of Kashmir. So just to summarize this slide, basically in this election cycle, it's still clear how India is playing with Kashmiri internal politics by replacing or even banishing leaders they know will oppose them if there was a referendum. Okay, so up to the Second Assembly, throughout the 1960s, the plebiscite front boycotted state elections, which strategically might have been a failure, as it just made it easier for their opponents to win. But the point they were trying to make was to show that any government that formed after those elections were not representative and therefore could not be legitimate. And in 1962, National Conference wins 68 out of 75 legislative assembly seats, 33 seats of which were unopposed. And this finally led to suspicions of a behavior, of a pattern of trying to leave as many seats as possible unopposed, and suspicion fell upon the leader Bakshi Ghulam Muhammad. There's not too much to summarize on this slide, so I'll carry on to the next one. Okay, so up to the Third Assembly, suspicions of Bakshi's electoral malpractices got too much. So on the 12th of October 1963, he's replaced with Khwaja Shamsuddin. And on December 1963, a relic was stolen from the Hazrat Bal shrine. Why do I mention this? Because even after the relic was recovered, there was still a lot of suspicion and a lot of distrust against the government for the way they handled it and the way the recovery worked out, the recovery of the relic worked out. So on the 29th of February 1964, Khwaja was replaced by Ghulam Muhammad Sadiq. In 1963, Hindu parties like Jammu Praja Parishad and Bharatiya Janasangh merge, and they connect the local Hindu concerns with the national Indian Hindu supremacists. And in 1965, the Kashmiri National Conference officially merged with the Indian National Congress. The INC is one of India's major political parties, and it led India to independence under Mahatma Gandhi. February 1967, Indian National Congress win about 60 of 75 legislative assembly seats, 39 of which were unopposed. Interestingly, in the process of the election, 55 candidates were rejected because they refused to take an oath of allegiance to the Constitution of India. So, as you can see, that clearly shows that there's still a strong desire for independence from India, and to demand their rights to a plebiscite and so on. And in this election cycle, just to summarize, we start to see Kashmiri politics merging with wider Indian parties. So, on one hand, you have the local Hindu groups joining with the national ones, which pushes the supremacist idea of a greater Hindu India. On the other hand, you have the largest Kashmiri party joining an Indian National Party, which would obviously, defang or take the power out of any claim for Kashmiri separation from India. So basically, you see that the join India side becomes stronger and the leave India side gets weaker. Um, Next slide, up to the 1972 election. So in 1969, Jamaat-e-Islami backed some candidates who were elected into local level authorities. 1971, 1971, Jamaat-e-Islami fielded candidates in parliamentary elections. They were confident of some wins, but they gained nothing, and they suspected rigging. The 2nd of July 1971, the Maintenance of Internal Security Act is passed, replacing the Preventative Detention Act, and that would allow indefinite detention, search and seizure without warrants, and wiretapping. And in 1971, East Pakistan seceded from Pakistan, becoming Bangladesh, And this is notable in this, in this conversation about Kashmir, because some commentators say this is what made Sheikh Mohammed reconsider his demand for a plebiscite, because he saw that Pakistan would not be able to defend Kashmir potentially joining them if they joined them after a referendum. So instead, he sought Kashmiri autonomy under India. On the other hand, some critics also say that he just wanted power and would be happy to trade leadership for the plebiscite demand. Okay, 1972, the plebiscite front, which was seen as Sheikh Mohammed's mouthpiece while he was in jail, they softened their language around the plebiscite and they stopped sounding so anti-Indian. And January 1972, the Indian National Congress win 58 out of 75 Legislative Assembly seats. The plebiscite front was outright banned. Jamaat-e-Islami expected to win 22 seats in the State Assembly, but won just 5, and they suspected rigging, and they claimed that their members had been harassed during the election, which made them less effective at campaigning. So, in summary, in this election cycle, you can see, for example, that the Muslim party, Jamaat-e-Islami, they're trying to get into the political space. They're making some gains, but they're also getting cheated out of making more gains. And that kind of mirrors how Kashmiris themselves were starting to feel about how India was running Kashmir's democracy. We also see here how regional politics between Pakistan and Bangladesh have a direct impact on Kashmiri internal politics. So Kashmiri leaders were thinking, if a whole chunk of Pakistan had just fought to leave it, should Kashmir push to join it? And that was not an easy question to answer. I'm not trying to make a point, but that was a question that weighed heavily on Kashmiri leaders' minds. And you can see why some leaders would be tempted to change their demands. All right, so up to the 1977 Fifth Assembly election. 1974, the plebiscite front. So remember Sheikh Mohammed's mouthpiece. They, as a party, dropped the plebiscite demand in return for a guarantee of autonomy under Article 370. And on the 24th of February 1975, the IndiraSheikh Accord is signed, giving the central Indian government power to pass laws that crush dissent in Kashmir. Okay, so to understand the context, to understand why both sides came to this accord, on one hand, you've got the leaders that India installed after Sheikh Mohammed's arrest. They were very unpopular in Kashmir, and India wanted Sheikh Mohammed back in charge because they knew it would be easier to hide their interference behind a popular leader. But there had been a stalemate all this time because Sheikh Mohammed wanted a reversal of authoritarian measures implemented since his arrest in 1953. So, as you probably noticed throughout the slides as I've been going through them, I was pointing out this law and that law that was cracking down on dissent, making it impossible to, support any referendum against India. Sheikh Mohammed wanted to clear all of that away, start from a clean slate kind of thing. Um, this accord happened because Sheikh Mohammed eventually changed his mind, as I explained in the previous slide. The treaty itself stated that Kashmir would become a constituent unit of India and that India would be able to bring in laws and powers that stopped secession of Indian land. So, I mean, what were the outcomes? Well, the treaty is not saying India will stop you voting to leave, but it is saying India will not let you leave even if you vote to do so. So, I mean, what would the ballot paper for such a referendum even say? I mean, seriously, the only thing it could say is stay with India, because any other option would not be allowed by India. And another outcome of this, by giving the Indian government powers to stop secession, um, and an almost obvious outcome, inevitable outcome, was that the number of interrogation centers would just explode around Kashmir. They would multiply, to the dozens, and they would become notorious for their torture, these so-called interrogation centers. Another outcome, was because, you know, this big party had dropped the plebiscite demand. Other parties, like Jamaat-e-Islami, took up the demand. They opposed the IndiraSheikh Accord because they saw it as a violation of the UN agreed resolutions on resolving the Kashmir issue. And last but not least, one final outcome of this accord was that Sheikh Mohammed would be installed as the chief minister of Kashmir without even an election, although he possibly did request one. So after all that was said and done, in 1975, the plebiscite front was reborn as the National Conference after India's central parliamentary Lok Sabha elections. And in 1976 to 77, the Jammu and Kashmir Liberation Front formed as a militant splinter wing, and they wanted full Kashmiri independence. Just want to make a note, there are other armed groups in Indian occupied Kashmir, but I mention Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front specifically just as an indicator of the mood in Kashmir, and, you know, just to show that this accord did not make life easier for Kashmiris. You know, this wasn't an accord that the people of Kashmir wanted. June 1977, the National Conference wins 47 out of 76 legislative assembly seats, and for the first time, all of the seats were contested. So it was a pretty decent election, and Jamaat-e-Islami won a seat. Okay, so you know, there's quite a lot on this slide, but to summarize, the basic point that I'd like you to take away from this slide is that the IndiraSheikh Accord traded the right to a plebiscite in exchange for the right to Kashmir's autonomy. So what I mean is, if that autonomy is taken away on one side of the deal, then the right to a Kashmiri vote, to a Kashmiri plebiscite, must be brought back on the other side of the deal. Okay, so up to the 1983 election. On the 8th of April 1978, the Jammu and Kashmir Public Safety Act is passed, giving Indian forces broad powers to keep so-called public order for the security of the state and to detain people for up to 2 years without charge or trial. And dissident party leaders would repeatedly be arrested under this act. And obviously, if you can imagine a leader of a political party getting arrested over and over again, you know, that political party is not going to gain power. So it stifled democratic dissent. 1982, the grant of permit for resettlement is passed, which would allow Kashmiris or their descendants who had left before 1954, they could return to resettle in Kashmir. This was seen by Indian nationalists as a backdoor that would let more Muslims and Pakistanis in and would be used as a political football by the Indian National Congress in the next election. So you can see here how politics is starting to get polarizing between those who want Kashmir to look out for its own interests and those who are looking out for Indian interests within Kashmir. On the 8th of September 1982, Sheikh Mohammed Abdullah died, and his son Farooq would take up the mantle of leadership. October 1983, the National Conference win 47 out of 76 legislative assembly seats, mainly in Kashmir, in the Kashmir Valley itself. And the Indian National Congress won 26 seats, mainly in Jammu. And from then onwards, elections would pretty much be religiously polarizing from this year onwards. There's not much to summarize on this slide, so I'll just move on. Okay, so up to the 1987 election. So July 1984, the National Conference Party is split by Farooq's brother-in-law and the Indian National Congress, bringing down Kashmir state government. And in 1986 to 87, Farooq is allowed back into power on condition of alliance with the Indian National Congress. This was called the Rajiv Farooq Accord. And it was seen as further capitulation by the National Conference to India. So just to sum up how people felt about it at the time, Farooq, is equally clear about the need to work hand in glove with the powers in Delhi. Farouk's campaign rhetoric and style clearly reflects this attitude. He is no longer wishy-washy in his commitment to secularism or in his opposition to forces that are anti-national. So, that's from India Today in 1987. Um, so on one hand, during the election, Farouk would promise greater investment from India if his alliance between National Conference and Indian National Congress won. On the other hand, the accord also seemed to be a power-hungry response to growing support for opposition groups, and the main opposition group being the Muslim United Front, which was an umbrella coalition of Muslim Kashmiri parties, including Jamaat-e-Islami, and their election manifesto pushed to resolve all issues according to the Shimla agreements, would push for Islamic unity, and would push to end interference from India. So in March to June 1987, during the election, voter turnout is the highest ever at 75 to 80%. And the National Conference win 40 out of 76 Legislative Assembly seats, and the Indian National Congress won 26. So, that adds up to 66 out of 76 seats. Yet, this was seen as heavily rigged because basically the two most powerful parties had united in order to crush opponents. They both of them put together received 53% of the vote, yet they ended up winning 87% of the seats. And in contrast, the Muslim United Front had 31% of the vote, but just 4 seats. They had expected to win 15 to 20 seats. On top of that, there were many reports of vote manipulation, counting delays, harassment and arrests, and torture of activists. And, years after the fact, there have been admissions of guilt, such as this one. I remember that there was a massive rigging in 1987 elections. The losing candidates were declared winners. It shook the ordinary people's faith in the elections and the democratic process. And this is an admission from an Indian National Congress leader, Khemlata Wukhlo. So, in summary, again, a lot to get through in this slide, but in this election cycle, the mask of Kashmiri democracy really begins to slip, revealing the Indian interference behind it. And by this point, India has pretty much taken back their promise of a referendum and passed so many laws that block opposition activists and leaders that they can afford to be open with their undermining of Kashmiri democracy. But this wasn't the straw that broke the camel's back when it comes to Kashmiri democracy. That would be in the next election cycle. So, leading up to governor's rule, 3rd of September 1987, the Terrorist and Disruptive Activities Act is passed. This is originally used to deal with insurgency activity in the Punjab, but was extended to Kashmir to arrest people for years without charge nor informing their families. 31st July 1988, after Indian forces bomb locations in Srinagar, Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front starts an armed struggle for full independence. In 1989, Jamaat-e-Islami forms Hizbul Mujahideen as a militant wing. 22nd to 26th of November 1989, Indian parliamentary elections are largely boycotted in Kashmir, with voter turnout under 6% in some areas, as the Kashmiri electorate lose all trust in Indian democracy. 1990, Jamaat-e-Islami finally join Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front in armed struggle, and they are subsequently banned as a political party. And on the 19th of January 1990, direct rule from New Delhi is imposed, and this leads to hundreds of days of curfews with searches and arrests. So, final thoughts, really. In summary, it's really clear that Kashmiris have a long tradition of being engaged in politics and trying to work with the political systems they live in. And when we see Kashmiri militancy today, it's because Kashmiri democracy has been taken from them. It's not because they just like violence. And it should also be just as clear that those in charge of Kashmir, from the Dogra princes to India's central government, they don't want Kashmiris to be engaged with their politics. This talk should have helped you understand that the Indian government is using every trick in the book to undermine Kashmiri democracy. We've talked through political parties and leaders being undermined. We've seen votes and ballots and even entire elections being undermined. So, what's their goal of destroying Kashmiri democracy? Is to reverse the promise made at the birth of India of letting the people of Kashmir choose their destiny. And this is highlighted most starkly with the IndiraSheikh Accord by trading the Kashmiri referendum for another empty promise that Kashmir would be respected within the Indian constitution. But all that did was swap one broken promise for another promise, which has now been broken because since August the 5th, 2019, last year, um, President Modi took out Article 370 and 35A from the Indian constitution. So the Indira Sheikh Accord has been broken by India. So therefore, India has even more of a right to a referendum. So what's next? Well, what are MPAC UK doing? What are we doing as an organization? We have this lecture series. This is the second in the lecture series. And we also have our timeline and fact sheet of what's happened in Kashmir. This lecture series is based on that. So if you prefer reading your information to listening to it, then feel free to download um, these resources. We are also building a campaign to boycott the BJP and their supporters. And we are networking with activists in UK, India, Kashmir, and elsewhere. So that's what we're doing. What can you do? Well, if you like what we're doing and you can give your time, please do volunteer with us if you're in the UK. If you like what we're doing but you don't have any spare time, please do donate if you can. And if you can't donate your time or your money, please do attend and promote the rest of the webinar series. And something that I would ask everyone to do at least is to help evaluate this webinar so we can improve our future lectures. So Jazakumullah khairan for listening. I'm going to hand over to Imran now. And we can start the Q&A.